when you look at the birth rates, and again compare a Korea or an Italy with a Nigeria or other parts of Africa, obviously some places are growing, some places are shrinking. What are we going to see around the world in terms of mass movements of people, and how might that impact us in New Zealand, either through the arrival of people on our shores or through the geopolitics we'll be dealing with? How do you think about some of those big mass movements at a global level?
Can I start? I mean, I think we've got to rethink our migrant sources. So if you look at the current arrival of migrants in 23, it's India, Philippines and China in that order. I can't see, it's what's called the Lewis turning point. China's moved into demographic deficit, and I can't see them allowing their best and brightest to migrate to New Zealand in the future, whether as international students or as skilled workers. So I think one of the things is that the offshore origin and source of our migrants is probably going to have to change. And we really haven't, apart from South Africa, looked at Sub-Saharan Africa as a source of migration. It's been very minor. And yet when you look at global demographics, then we might need to rethink that in quite significant ways. The other thing is, of course, that all of these ageing societies are going to look to migration to top up their labour market supply shortages. So again, I think places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand have been very successful with their points system in capturing some of that talent pool that's out there internationally. But whether that will actually continue into the future, I think is a moot point and needs rethinking.
Population ageing, as one of my colleagues in Australia called it, an inconvenient truth. And because people are sort of slowly engaging with the idea first, you know, there's going to be more elderly, or they get the idea that people having fewer children mean that the larger numbers of old population also become a larger proportion. But they don't take the next step and go, well, what happens when you have more elderly than children? Well, it's about 10 years once you have more elderly than children to having more deaths than births. And it's a situation that we haven't encountered before. The most important thing is I've done this analysis across 660-something TAs in Australia over 15 years, and I've worked with my colleagues across Europe, and we never see any populations, once they cross a certain threshold, come out of the end of growth for very long. You know, you can get a bit of growth for another 5 or 10 years, but the ageing eventually overwhelms it. So the big message is the ABC of population ageing is accept it is coming to a local area near you, even if not right away. I think it's really important that your local population understands these pictures, these trends. They have amazing demands for things, but they want, and especially, you know, start getting up to a third of your population is in the rates discount group. You know, the rates discounts for older people are unsustainable in the future. They need to understand that. There's a lot of special type matching skills, training needs and so on. I'm sure you'd work all that out. United Nations says that the numbers are so huge that we can't change them. The trends are so huge. They have 3 frameworks. If you want to keep your population the same size overall, that's not too hard. A certain number of migrants will do it. If you want to keep your working age population the same size, that's a bit harder. If you want to keep the ratio of your current, of elderly to working age at its current levels, it's darn near impossible. So respond in terms of revisiting all your policies and the principles on which they were based, because many of those policies were developed when we had the baby boom and when we were youthful and growing. My colleagues that work on Japan, Peter Natalie and Rausch, they say that it will increasingly come down to things like your town or mine, and that's the debate, that's the discussion that's going on in places like Japan and America and a lot of these areas. I think we will see the emergence of modern ghost towns. We've got a PhD student going to be looking at that soon. Amalgamation, not necessarily in terms of your particular TAs, but certainly shared services and so on of certain things, a B word. your local trouble, if you are a declining region, is a national issue and it should be put on the national agenda and dealt with that way. I mentioned the fiscal equalisation policies, and I draw your attention again, Auckland and the rest. Sir Bob and I have presented a few times together, and he's very proudly telling everybody how Auckland's just going to grow and it's going to take all these young people, and I'm thinking, what about Morrinsville and my house? Celebrate. Celebrate. Now, we're definitely getting the A accept, although it usually comes with alarm and awareness and then alarm. What do we do about it? The B is go back and look at all your policies and how you generate your income and how you spend it and all that, and revise it. Celebrate. If you do it in time, you will be able to manage the process of the ageing, but you will not be able to stop it. So what we have to start doing is looking for what the advantages are, and many economists are saying that the ending of growth, for example, you won't have to stretch the dollar across more and more people, invest more deeply in the people you have. We saw on your slide, Ross, the decline in the other welfare, non-superannuation welfare. That's because the projection is for diminishing youth unemployment as the labour market tightens up. So there'll be lots of positives, but to get to them, we'll have to involve collaboration, they will involve conservation, and that's the capital deepening, that we'll be able to do capital deepening rather than capital widening. I have been called the Pollyanna demographer for my positive approach to it. It was an attempt to cover off on being called Dr. Doom and Gloom, and when I first went to Tasmania and told Tasmania about this, but everything that I did say in Tasmania in 1998 has come true, and that was the negative labour market entry-exit ratios in 28 of the 29 local government areas. Tasmania took over from South Australia as the oldest state around about 2003, and I had projected each of those things, as had Australian Bureau of Statistics, but I was the one that went around talking about it. These things are unfolding, and even if they just take a little bit longer to get to you, that's the picture that you are dealing with in the future.
There's an issue that's behind, or maybe a consequence of a lot of what we're talking about, and that's social cohesion. We are looking at a very different population. Run the New Zealand Economics Conference Forum 2044. This room will look different. The students in the university will look different. The people walking down Queen Street and the streets of Invercargill will look different. How do we stay together as a population? What does it mean to be a nation or a group of people? And what would you like to see, so that's all theoretical, high stuff, in a practical sense, what would you like to see from government or from civic institutions around maintaining social cohesion at a time of vastly different population? Sarah? And despite the grandiosity of the question, we've got 4 minutes before we're invaded, so.
Yeah, so I think that our absolute strength will come from our diversity, and that is what we should really focus on celebrating. Our diversity will be differently experienced across the country, but it will be, we'll have fastest rates of good diversity in our regions and strongest concentrations in our urban areas. So that is really important, and I think we need to, I've been sadly doing quite a lot of work on misinformation and disinformation, and I am really concerned about cultural imported values around social cohesion, and I think we need to safeguard those and, continue to really celebrate what is unique about New Zealand.
Paul?
As one of the co-authors of the Cabinet paper on social cohesion, which Cabinet did not want a bar of, I'm a little jaundiced here. And if I had to guess at why Cabinet, because I wasn't in the room, I think they found it all too much. It's all-encompassing. It's a really challenging space to be in, and yet I think we fundamentally need it. And I would remind you that the Royal Commission made social cohesion one of the policy priorities after they considered the Christchurch shooting. So it should be part of our policy settings. However, as somebody who's just come out of the DPMC and the Centre for Countering Violent Extremism as its director, and as a diversity judge, I've got to say that the last 5 years have made social cohesion in this country much more problematic. The online world is really very hostile, aggressive, very shouty, and very, very threatening to many of our minority communities, Jewish, Muslim, trans, our teenagers in this country. And so I was caught out by the impact of social media and of COVID and what emerged through COVID. So suddenly our challenge around social cohesion has become that much more important and that much more challenging.
Thank you.
Let me start with my pessimistic side. The last 5 to 7 years has seen a distinct shift in the Overton window in radicalizing and normalizing radical ideas yet again, and the sheer volume of it, the fact that it is a global ecosystem, online system, which makes it difficult for country states like ourselves to govern and to manage. And also, it is, to me, a little puzzling that you in Canada, we in New Zealand, should be so influenced by QAnon or sovereign citizen or any other sets of politics that come out of the United States, which bear no relationship in many respects to our own political histories, even though those, you know, I'm not wanting to de-criticize those histories. I want to maintain a critical approach to them.
Britain was no longer the superpower that we knew, and it turned its attention to becoming part of Europe despite de Gaulle's antagonism. The cultural and economic umbilical cord that had tied New Zealand to Britain for most of its colonial history was now under threat. The new superpower was, of course, the USA, and it was to provide one very interesting dimension and influential exemplar of protest politics. The black civil rights movement gained in momentum through the 1950s and 1960s, and it was to supply Māori activists with a new rhetoric as well as some new strategies. Interestingly, that rhetoric did not necessarily come from those black American activists, but it came from the French Caribbean in the form of writers and activists such as Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon. Here were arguments about the importance of black activism in the process, what was increasingly a global process of decolonisation. After all, the white working class and their organisations were not going to be interested in helping blacks. It was also a time of rebellion of the young. As the English commentator Eric Hobsbawm notes, the golden age of widespread influence was coming to an end, and the student uprisings in Paris in May 1968 soon had global equivalents from communist Europe to the USA and Mexico, and of course New Zealand.
So I do see a polarization, and what keeps me awake at night is how you overcome that degree of polarization, the unwillingness of communities to not treat others respectfully, to attack others, to be very vitriolic and hateful, and not to be guided by facts. Now, there's in terms of what we're doing, there's little that we can find yet to mount something which is effective an answer to that. And what's happened is, of course, that it's gone from being Indigenous or immigrant or Muslim or Jew to transphobic, misogynistic. And so my Prime Minister stood down because of the level of both domestic and international misogyny that she was facing.
And when I look back and look at what's happening at the moment, then many of the frameworks and the approaches that we developed through those very difficult decades in the 70s and 80s, both particularly in Europe, not so much in this country, then I think they continue to have relevance today. There are some changes. The Great Replacement is obviously part of the same theme of these groups imagining a racial threat.
And I apologize for being the quantitative poli-sci academic, so hence the slides, but I just want to say I'm not going to be anywhere near as wide-ranging as Anne. I'm focusing strictly on the West. That's Western Europe, North America, Australasia, and also only on right-wing populism, not on left-wing populism. I think there's a really important frame for this, which is the global demographic revolution, which is really about the unevenness in global population trends around the world. So 97% of the world's population growth is taking place in the global south, the tropical belt, which is obviously non-European, but also highly religious, and the source of most of the immigration present and future for the West. What that means is a dramatic shift in the ethnic and religious composition of Western societies. And this is ultimately what I'm going to be arguing is behind the rise of right-wing populism. If the West was like Japan or Korea, we wouldn't have right-wing populism, pure and simple. It is about immigration and ethnic change. Those changes are going to be dramatic. Already we know in the US, the shift from a population that was about 85% non-Hispanic white in 1960 to what is projected to be only 50% of the population non-Hispanic white in 2050. That same process is occurring in New Zealand and Canada, both of which will also become majority-minority around 2050. Canada, where I'm from, actually has you can look at the dramatic, there was a projection by Statistics Canada demographers that showed in the year 2006, the country is about 80% European origin, 20% non-European. 100 years later, in 2106, those proportions will be roughly reversed. Now, that's not everywhere is going to move as fast as Canada, but what David Coleman, the demographer, calls the third demographic transition towards this complete ethnic transformation of Western societies